Hi, everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome, and it's good to see you. Can you hear me? May I please request if you can just type yes in the chat so I know that you can hear me. All right, brilliant. Okay, so I'm here today. For those of you I'm meeting for the first time, my name is Dale, and it's great to meet you. Over the next 45 minutes or so, I'd like to talk you through a little bit about arts integration in school education. And hopefully at the end of this all, we can take some questions. And I'm going to request, please, if you can put your questions in the Q&A box. I'm flying solo today, so I cannot monitor the chat and the Q&A box until we reach the end, where I will then answer whatever questions. So welcome, and let's get started. For those of you joining us from other parts of the world, in the US, it's either good night or good morning. If you're in the UK, it's good morning. And if you're in the far, far east, it's good evening. But for all of us over here, and most of us, it's good afternoon. So let's get started. Well, they say, what got you here won't get you there. So this is Marshall Goldsmith's big book with a title like that. But I think it's also very, very relevant to education because it's always a very dynamic and constantly changing subject. And hence, we look for innovation and we look for improvement, not just in education, but I guess this holds true for life as well. So I thought I would start by perhaps setting a little bit of a context to how did it come to arts integration? Where did we begin? And how did that journey go? So I kind of put together a very brief timeline to kind of tell you what really happened. So pre-industrial revolution, there was a gentleman, Elwood Cubley, who basically compared teachers to kind of factory workers. At that time, the industrial revolution was picking up some steam. And he said, well, teachers are the factory workers and students are the raw material for this new world that lies out there. Now, because of thinking like this, we started to see that the industrial model for education was adopted. And as a result of which schools mimicked factories and learning was quite passive and solitary. And there was a greater value that was placed on silence and conformity, and teachers just deposited information into children. And of course, children did what they had to do, which was memorize it and repeat it. So now this is a moment for inflection because while this kind of happened between the early 1900s, some of our education systems have still to feel this change and are still perhaps following a system like this. And then, of course, this kind of paved the way for the traditional education, so to speak. And that's what we knew for a good many years. But somewhere around the 1920s, things started to shake up and they started to question whether this kind of system really works and if it works well. And during the 1920s to the 50s, there were some really important contributions that were made. A gentleman called John Dewey came out and said that to teach, we have to teach students how to think. And he believed that students really learn best by doing. And then somewhere in the 30s, Lev Vygotsky, a Russian scientist and social theorist, said that everybody learns by observing what's happening in society around them. And this was furthered by Jean Piaget's words, where he said basically it's not so much about acquiring content, but rather by constructing it from within. And hence the birth of constructivism, or at least the thinking of constructivism started somewhere there. And of course, it wasn't just that. In the 1950s, and this is something we're all very familiar with, a gentleman by the name of Benjamin Bloom, an American educational psychologist, posited that through a taxonomy that he created, that it will help learners even better. And one of the things that he argued for is that teachers need to be able to ask questions that elicit higher levels of thinking, where they go from the lower order, which is knowledge, to the higher order, which is being able to process all of that and evaluate as well. So this was some interesting work that was done then. And then, of course, came the 60s, the 70s. I think generally the world was enjoying the fruits of the Industrial Revolution. Baby boomers started. And of course, a lot of parties also happened. But then came Howard Gardner. And he developed the theory of multiple intelligences, which I'm sure you're quite familiar with, or at least have heard of. And he said the range of human intelligence is very wide and deep. And he said that there are basically 8 intelligences that we use and can use to learn. So these were the 8 that he posited, and he said there's linguistic, there's logical, there's spatial, there's bodily, and that's kinesthetic, there's musical, there's interpersonal, there's intrapersonal, and there's the naturalist. So this Bloom's taxonomy, as many of you would know, kind of went through a couple of iterations. And with each round, it became really, really interesting. And I dare say that a lot of schools follow a great amount of their teaching based on Bloom's taxonomy. But of course, it wasn't just there that work happened. Daniel Pink, an American author, in his book, A Whole New Mind, showed us how we're moving from an informational age to a conceptual age. And when you think about it, it's all about creating and creativity. And that's where a lot of us who develop creative skills will find the future. And he kind of said that there are basically a few types of people who would do really well in life. They're artists, inventors, designers, storytellers, caregivers, and big picture thinkers. So this means that if you go back to ideation and the creation of an idea, it's now no longer stuck in the concrete, this is the solution to the problem kind of thing. It's more about what is the issue really about. So a problem is abstracted to a much higher level, where we now are looking at big picture solutions and big picture thinking. And this wasn't the only development. There were a couple of others. Sir Ken Robinson, a name that needs really no introduction, very, very famous for his TED talk about creativity in education. And he spoke about it and said that there has to be radical change for us to be able to meet the challenges of the 21st century. And he, of course, said that society needs people that can do all of these 6 things that you can read on your screen, which is think intuitively and be imaginative and communicate well and collaborate well and work with teams and is self-confident. And a lot of that of self-confidence comes from within. Once you are secure in what you know and secure in what you do, and most importantly, secure in how to apply it, that self-confidence is born. But then there was also work done by several others, including Robert and Michelle Ruth Bernstein. Robert is a professor in physiology, and Michelle is an historian. Both of them are authors, but she's also a haiku poet. And they basically, in their book, Sparks of Genius, said that we must comprehend the nature of creative thinking if we are to devise an educational system capable of training creative thinkers. And they went on to talk about a few tools which are over here. And this book was really based on following several of the most creative minds. And then after spending time with them, listing down what it is that they do. So observing, imagining, forming patterns, and so on. And David Souza is a very, very important person in this whole link, because he kind of connects all these beliefs with arts integration. And he says, educational researchers and cognitive scientists believe there are ideal conditions for learning. And, hold your breath, remarkably, arts integration generates these conditions. So there you have it. For the first time, the complete link is closed. And that starts the whole discussion around arts integration and looking at it as a subject. Now, before we get any further, I just thought I should also tell you what I would like to cover today. So we're going to talk about arts integration. We're going to talk about arts in education. We're going to talk about how Trinity College London and works with arts education. And then we're going to talk about a pathway and how we can also look at doing this, where we start integrating all of this into curriculums. So let's start at the very beginning over here. All of this was just context and a little bit of history. We now look at what is arts integration. So in essence, this is the definition. Arts integration is an approach to teaching in which students construct and demonstrate understanding through an art form. Students engage in a creative process which connects an art form and another subject area and meets evolving objectives in both. So if we split up this definition, you get several very, very insightful and interesting components to it. So you see that this definition begins with the assertion that arts integration is larger than an activity. In fact, arts integration is an approach to teaching that is embedded in one's daily practice. So the approach refers to the how something is taught rather than the what is taught. So as you can see, there's emphasis on context and less on content. And every teacher, of course, has an approach to teaching, whether or not they are aware of it. Approaches that we use as teachers fall along a continuum from traditional that we saw kind of teaching at the early 1900s to teacher-centered instruction to more progressive student-centered instruction. Now, as an approach to teaching, arts integration relies heavily on the progressive student-centered end of the continuum. So that's the approach to teaching. Now, if we look at this even a little deeper, and we referred to construction and constructivism, which Piaget kind of first introduced us to, it basically says that learners construct knowledge rather than just passively take in information. So what this really means is that in this process, students draw on their prior knowledge. They need hands-on learning with authentic problems to solve. They learn from each other, which was the work of Vygotsky that said socially children develop. They also engage and reflect about what they learned, how they learned it, and what it means. And they also use their peers' work to do some sort of review. So as you can see, this is really interesting. And of course, it doesn't end there. It also gives them a chance then to revise and improve their work. And most importantly, it gives us or gives students the opportunity to take risks, to explore, to build within a cooperative framework. So this is how the teaching and the learning kind of works hand in hand. But now when we move over to the next part of the definition, which is understanding. So constructing understanding of one's world is an active mind engaging process. Information must be mentally acted upon in order to have meaning for the learner. So it goes beyond the initial step of helping students learn and recall information to challenging students to take the information and facts they have learned and do something with them to build deeper understanding. So if we look even a little further, students then can start to demonstrate this understanding both in a formative way as well as in a summative way. For example, and this is when now it starts to combine. For example, when students are, let's say, challenged to work as presenters to create a speech that demonstrate how the seasons change, let's say in grade 4. that is essentially where there's learning and development that's happening both in the art form of presenting, and that's of communication, and also knowing thoroughly the concept of changing seasons, which is a science-based concept. So this way, we are exploring both the art forms, all right? Now, when it comes to defining an art form, I mean, I think we know that across the country and the world, classrooms have become and continue to become more culturally, economically, and academically diverse. But yet, sometimes we see a great deal of instruction relies primarily and sometimes almost exclusively on speaking and writing, or in our case, reading and writing, for students to actually be able to demonstrate what they know. And today's research basically points to the power of learning through a variety of senses or modalities. So teachers are encouraged to plan instruction that engages students in visual, oral, and kinesthetic learning modalities so that students can actively process what it is that they're learning. Now, we've looked at it thus far as an art form, all right? And as you can see in an art form, they also have a way to now find expression, find engagement, and most importantly, get a chance to explore and take risks. But when we look at the other part of the definition, it's also in the making. And when students engage in the creative process, they produce original work that communicates their ideas, their insights, points of view, and feelings. And sometimes this creative process can be quite messy. It is difficult to predict what will happen or emerge during the process. So learners engage in inquiry, experimentation, as opposed to following rigid step-by-step rules. Some ideas, once explored, may work well, and some ideas, by exploring, we know don't work. Now, this is where, as teachers, it becomes incumbent upon us to allow for this little messiness where students can explore. Because if we want a neat process, then really what we're going to be doing is making the choices for students. And that in itself is not really very creative. So this is an opportune time in the process for teachers to allow for experimentation, for students to take initiative and deliver. And we must give them the flexibility. And in fact, we must even create the environment within which this must happen. So the creative process in the arts is a process and not a single event. As you can see through this drawing, there are many descriptions, all right? And the one over here is a synthesis of ideas from many sources. But the most important thing to understand in this creative process is that all these circles are virtually open. So at one hand, you could be imagining and sharing, all right, or you could be imagining and experimenting and exploring, or there could be imagination and reflection. So you see, it's not just circuitous, it is across all realms. And this is very interesting, and it's a lovely model to consider from a creative process point of view. Which brings me, of course, to a distinguishing aspect of arts integration is its interdisciplinary connection. So let me give you an example. One is where the art form, all right, connects with the curriculum area. So for instance, dramatization, all right, and something from geography or science, or communication and something from history or language or biology, all right. Similarly, you can also use the art form for a concern or a need, and this is where Augusto Boal's theater of the masses and theater of the oppressed comes from, is the art form is used because there is a need in society. So within schools, we can look at it as drama to highlight character education or collaboration habits, or to develop multiple intelligences. So This then finally comes to the last part, which is evolving objects in both. All right. So in the final part of this definition, it basically underscores two key ideas where the objectives of the art form. So if it's drama, then the objective of drama. And if it's drama married with any of the other scholastic subjects, then there's a learning in the subject also. So this is how the evolution happens. All right. So this in a nutshell is what arts integration is all about. It brings me now to talk a little bit about arts in education and to discover three important things. So as you can see from this drawing, there are three parts to it: arts as a curriculum, arts enhanced curriculum, and an arts integrated curriculum. So very quickly, if we try and get our head around all of this, it would look something like this, where we look at art as a curriculum. All right. So this is really where a school or an institution has a dedicated teacher around the art form. And then students develop knowledge and skills in that particular art form. All right. But often this is referred to as art for art's sake, or you're just paying lip service to the art form. And here is where I think it's up to us to create that distinction as to at what level of depth and proficiency do we want it to be taught and learned. All right, so this is more of an attitudinal thing, but essentially where it's happening in a school, but it's only developing that art form, then we call it arts as a curriculum. All right, now you have the other one, which is the arts enhanced curriculum. So in an arts enhanced curriculum, you really see that the art form is really not studied, right? There's no formative work done, but it is used as a means to an end. To learn something else, they use the art form, all right? So very often you see, for instance, children, let's say when they sing the ABCs, all right, in a certain cadence, which is a means to an end. I mean, for them to be able to really remember the letter, the sequence of the alphabet. But they're not really, students are not really asked to remember the song structure or to understand the song structure or to develop even singing skills. They will all sing, and very often in unison, but because that's the way towards you remembering the ABC. So that's essentially what an arts enhanced curriculum is. So there's no development of the art. They're just using art as a means to an end. And very often we see this also with, in many educational institutions, the approach to, for instance, using drama, all right, is you put up a skit during the time of assembly. So there's no real formal training that happens towards that skit. It's just a little bit of think through in the rehearsal, maybe once or twice, but it's not really an art form. So very often this becomes a good way to engage students into learning, all right? And here in this kind of form, obviously, because we're still teaching just one part of the subject and not the art form, there is no real formal need or requirement for teachers to have training in the art form, okay? Now, then we have come to an arts enhanced curriculum where the arts are used as a device or strategy to support other curriculum areas, all right? And this is what I was just explaining. But as you would see also over here, that in a curriculum like this, we find this in a lot of schools, a lot of primary schools, a lot of schools where education has also been kind of evolved from seeing what other schools do. There is no necessity over here for academic rigor in the subject. All right. Now we come to the really interesting one, which is the arts integrated curriculum. All right. And in the arts integrated curriculum, the art becomes both the approach to teaching and the vehicle for learning. All right. So it's both ways. And students in this case meet dual learning objectives when they can engage in the creative process, all right, as well as also develop the subject area of another cross-matched subject. So you use drama, like I mentioned earlier, you could use music, you could use singing, you could use acting, you could use communication skills. Now, what is very interesting over here is that the process becomes mutually reinforcing. So both skills are getting developed. And for this essentially to work, it is important that teachers have some element of formation, and they don't have to have necessarily a degree or in this art form, but they must at least go through some sort of a professional development to kind of shape the understanding of the teaching of the subject, as well as cadence of the subject, as well as how to marry the two together. So this is what we see in an arts integrated curriculum. So just to remind you, three types, okay, art as curriculum, art enhanced curriculum, and arts integrated curriculum. And if you kind of look at the key takeaways, all right, from this discussion, it's basically to point out that while we liberally use the word, we have arts education, it's important to know what approach of arts education are you using. Are you using it as a curriculum because you have a drama teacher? Or are you using it without any formal evolution of the drama art form or the art form? Or are you using it in conjunction with both? So very often we see schools trying to do this particular one. And this is where we can really immensely help because we can help in the professional development, we can help in the subject depth of the art form, and we can also suggest and help build it with the curriculum. All right. Now, of course, for many schools, we can't forget this part, but for many schools, all of these things come at a cost, in the sense that a parent has to pay for it. And we understand that not all parents can necessarily afford this. So in the absence of anything, even some form of art is still better than no form of art. All right. But now perhaps I can move to the part where I tell you how we can solve this problem. And this is where Trinity kind of comes in, whether you're using arts as a curriculum or an arts enhanced curriculum or an arts integrated curriculum, we have something for all of you. All right. And very specifically, let me tell you how. So if you, for instance, look at, so you have the parameter where arts is as a curriculum, an enhanced curriculum and an integrated curriculum. I've put the definition over there just so that it's easier to be clear. But if you are using a Trinity syllabus, then if you're using arts as a curriculum, you can use both the learning outcomes and the assessment criteria. All right. And you can also do this through tasks. All right. And there's guidance on how to assess those tasks. Okay. If you're using it as an arts enhanced curriculum, then you could just only maybe look at the learning outcomes. All right. And so for instance, if a child has to recite poetry. Now, in this particular case, they maybe made a poem around something in the biology class or in the English class. So here there's not so much of focus on how you said the poem and how did you express it and what did you understand. It's more a way of using a lyrical meter perhaps to express that particular subject. All right. But in an arts integrated curriculum, and that's the last option that you see, here you can use the learning outcomes, you can use the assessment criteria, plus there is an assessment of the art form, right, which is in the subject. And there's also use of the art form in teaching or learning another subject, right? So an example of this would be the tasks, how to assess, plus the skills developed, plus the evaluation of another subject area using the art form and skills, all right? So I hope that's quite clear, and I think it should be, but like I said, I'd be happy to take questions in about 15 minutes from now, which leaves me with just giving you the touch points of how a syllabus of Trinity can help you, no matter which sphere of arts education that you're looking at. So here you see, this is the syllabus, all right? And there are different pages in the syllabus that talk about different things. Let me take you through a little bit of that. Every syllabus of ours in the art form talks very specifically, all right, about the relevance of the subject, right? How is it important? Why is it important? All right. And also mentions some of the skills that can be developed. All right. And I'll talk a little bit more about the skills. Um, Also, if you're trying to map it with your school, or if you're doing this for the first time, or you're attending one of our webinars today for the first time, then a syllabus will also give you age guidance and age recommendations. So you will understand how to try and integrate it. All right. The other thing is, of course, if you're looking at it from an assessment point of view, where arts is a curriculum, then you even have an exam structure or an assessment structure which tells you marks. But everything that Trinity does is not just in the context of an art form, it is in the context of developing skills because of the world in which we live in. So hence it would mean that there's an opportunity to develop what you are studying, and there's an opportunity to even take it to a level of proficiency in further and higher education. So very often, and there's a dedicated page, that's the recognition page in the syllabus, that tells you how our qualifications help you internationally, how is it benchmarked, and so on. And because you are learning a skill, right, we believe that skill is acquired by putting in time, not by learning it by heart. All right. So all of our grades even kind of give you a rough assessment of the number of hours it takes to develop that skill and that proficiency. So it's truly about hands-on learning and hands-on application. Okay. Um, which brings me to this very dedicated and important page in our syllabus, which talks about the real world skills. Now, I know it's difficult to read the slide, so don't worry too much about it. Just pay attention to the one on the extreme left, because this is there in the syllabus. And I will happily provide you a link to the syllabus for you to download. So don't worry about reading the fine print, in this case at least. But these are the skills that get addressed. So, I mean, and when you look at these skills, you realize that it's not just children who need it, but very often we see adults having difficulty with these skills. In fact, yesterday I was doing a program for one of the leading company in India, and with their senior management, and these were some of the skills that we were working on. And then you realize that these are either missed, skipped, or omitted when we are teaching children, which is why if we want to kind of secure and make our children a little more future proof, particularly at a time when things constantly seem to change, then skills is what we need to be worried about. All right. So this is the other set of skills that are also covered over here. Now, I also mentioned, and this is my favorite part, is both as a teacher and even as a parent and even as a student, you want to know what am I learning? What am I working towards? All right. So in traditional education, I go to school. If it's this year I'm in grade 5, I know what my science portion is. And then when I go to grade 6, there's no necessary kind of connection between 5 and 6 subject topics. It could just be a random collection, which is kind of felt that this is appropriate for this age. And of course, in math, that's different. They kind of seed it very well. And of course, in India, we are a STEM kind of country, which is why the inclusion of the arts is coming back now. And that's kind of funny because about 2000 years ago, India and in the early ages, we led in the teaching of arts, humanities. Sadly, over the last 500 years, with the advent of the colonial era, so to speak, the education system of the old kind of just went away and the new one came in. And hence I said, sometimes some of the things that of the last 300-400 years may have gotten us to where we are today, but it certainly is not going to get us to where we need to be. And hence it needs to think of strategies. And sometimes they also say old is gold. So probably what was relevant 2000 years ago is again relevant today. But anyway, this is my favorite part where the learning outcomes are stepped. All right. And as you can see, children and learners don't just start off with persuasion. All right. They first start off with being able to express themselves about concrete things and then start to move to more abstract things. So even if you're a school and even if you don't do Trinity exams, that doesn't mean you cannot use our syllabus. Please use our syllabus. In fact, we'll still help you incorporate whatever you'd like and help you build a more robust system for your children. So hence the learning outcomes kind of pave the way for that. And if you wanted to know, there's also a pathway through which you could actually do this, wherein if you look at the skills that really children need in life, they need to learn confidence, but confidence is not something, it has to come from within. So it has to be rooted, and it's done ideally when children are very young. And thereafter it's built upon. So in the pathway that we always work with, we look at the skills and we look at the subjects. So we know that children between 3 to 7, let's say, we're working on confidence. And then from 5 onwards, we know that all children need language skills, at least the ability to speak and listen, because very often this may be overlooked in conventional education because of the sheer classroom sizes. Yet in an individual capacity, as an adult, working functional adult, you need to be able to speak and listen. And if it's not taught to you, then that's why we find a lot of people struggling. So hence, that's what we establish, let's say, from children at the age of 5 onwards. And then when they're a little older, we now start to bring in the art forms. So we use music, we use communication skills, we use performance arts, you can use Indian art forms, you can use drama, you can use acting, you can use musical theater, and cross-match these with what is happening in this curriculum of the scholastic curriculum, all right? And at a higher age, you can take that to another level of refinement. And all of this, by the way, would do this in a structure where it is completely regulated, it is completely benchmarked to international standards. It also may give you the opportunity to take it as further and higher education, because all of them are put in a sequential layer of mastery and working towards mastery. Which brings me to this big question that a lot of teachers normally in schools face, which is they want to integrate it, but they don't know how to integrate it. So I want to give you an example, and I actually did this in a school, in fact, at my own children's school. And this is what we did, is we essentially first got into the planning stage where we identified grade-wise what are the learning outcomes that we should work with and which subject areas we should work with, all right? Then we identified what are the skills that the children will develop in this process, all right? We then thought through a little bit about how we're going to devise the teaching, all right? So whether it was through pair work, or whether it was through group work, or whether it was through a little bit of gamification, or whether it was through activities, and a little bit of theory on the art form. We did all of that, and then we modeled this entire thing into exercises and roles that each of us would play. And when I say each of us, I mean what would we help the teachers in the school with, what would the teachers do with the children, and what the children had to do. And then, of course, we got into lesson planning. And finally, of course, looking at what the children did, because many of them then went on and did a Trinity exam in the art form, in addition to, of course, doing their school exams in the subject form. So this is how we do it with the school, and this is what my colleagues in the academic team and myself are very happy to help with. But to kind of give you a very practical implementation, so essentially no school has time for a timetable, all right? But what we did is, in this particular case, is we said, we're going to work with this art form of communication skills in all these periods that you see highlighted, including Hindi, all right? So communication is not restricted to English, right? And we'll do it in physics, and we'll do it in math and sports and so on and so forth. So essentially what happened is that in the Hindi period, the teacher would follow her curriculum of the Hindi lesson, but she would get the children to show what they've learned in the Hindi lesson by communicating about it, or in certain cases, even putting up a dramatic play. And the same with physics. All right. And the same with chemistry. Imagine molecules, when you talk about molecules joining and separating, we actually did this through drama. And honestly, the children had a lot of fun, and quite frankly, they'll remember that lesson for the rest of their life. And if you think about it, I mean, even us, if you remember our best days in school, it wasn't in the classroom. All right, it was when we did something either on the sports field or when something outstanding happened, even if you were standing out of the class. Those are the days you remember. So the learning comes from, again, being involved, devising, constructing your own reality and your own learning. So this is what we did with the school. And I'll give you even a far more practical thing. So in week 1, the Hindi teacher did it. All right. In week 2, all right. So this was a floating period. In week 2, the physics teacher, for instance, took on communication skills. So she used what she was doing in physics combined with communication skills. In week 3, the math teacher did it. In week 4, the sports teacher did it. So we did this across all these 9 different subjects in the school, which meant that firstly, it became fun. Nobody was stuck with trying to teach this one subject. All right. Very often in school, we kind of think that, okay, if it's anything that's got nothing to do with the maths and sciences, it must be the English teacher's problem. So whether it's preparing for the annual day or preparing for an assembly or teaching English, everything the English teacher will do, or the class teacher. So it doesn't work that way, because I think you realize that art forms are not specific to people or roles. It's generic, it's everybody's. So what happened in this way is that one teacher had to devise a plan with her subject and the art form every 9 weeks. All right. And a normal school year has 36 weeks. So you're talking about 4 times in the year. All right. Or once every quarter. And this became a lot of fun because the kids kind of looked forward to it. The school kind of also not only had better ability at studying and retention and ability to engage, but the children also developed real world skills and then did a Trinity exam, which gave them an additional certificate. So this is something to think of. By the way, there are 3 plans over here. Don't worry, you might not be able to see too much of it. And that's probably because it's a little crunched, but I am sending this to you as a document. Essentially what we've done is there are 3 types of plans of how to integrate it into schools. So we've seen basically 3 types of schools, and hence I've put sample plan 1, sample plan 2, and sample plan 3. Each one is for a different mold of school. All right. So, and by the way, you can always reach out and ask for help and to understand this, or do you even explain it, and do you even devise one unique to you. So this is sample plan 2, and this is sample plan 3. All right. Now, just to remind you that in sample plan 2, there's even something for teachers. So a couple of schools in the country use some of our subjects to also benchmark their teachers, because these are internationally rated standings. So this way they also know where the teachers can have professional development, so on. So that kind of brings me to the end of where we are for today, with exactly a bang on time. All right, I wanted to keep 58 minutes for a Q&A, but I also want to just tell you that next week, or next Friday, in fact, a dear colleague of mine is going to be deep diving a little bit. In fact, we're introducing a new series called the Spotlight series in our webinars, where we're really basically going to look at different aspects. It could be syllabus related. Mostly it won't be syllabus related, but it could be on some interesting element of teaching, an interesting element of learning, an interesting element for teachers, maybe in your own practice, or in fact, we're looking at one where about vocal health in teachers, and we're looking at some really interesting ones coming up. So that will be on a Friday on the December 17th. So I'm going to just stop sharing my screen. One last thing I'm going to be sharing with you, and this is again in a handout and a link. If you really want to build skills in your classroom, I'm sharing with you a document which tells you very specifically, it's a little booklet from DePaul University. And I think it's just generally helpful if you want to build awareness on this. So I will be sharing this with you. So if you don't mind, I'm going to stop sharing over here now. We're coming up into the Q&A session, and I'd be happy to kind of take any questions that you may have. All right.